I'm scared.
There's never 3 episodes in. We don't even have an intro yet.
Nope.
No.
Well,
All right.
welcome back.
Welcome back, everybody.
Change of setting. We're in my living room now.
Mm-hmm.
This is gonna be fun.
Hopefully the audio doesn't fuck up. And again, if it does, we have failed you yet again.
Mm-hmm.
But we live and learn.
So, welcome back to episode 3. No, this one's kind of late, but episode 3 and 4 are gonna go kind of hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
And today we are going to be talking on hate. With everything that's been going on, I think we felt that this was kind of a more important topic to bring up first out of the giant list of stuff that we have already.
Mm-hmm.
So in this episode, we're going to be breaking down hate, how it comes about, what it looks like. And in the next episode, we're going to be talking about the best way to address hate and hopefully start to drive it out of our societies.
Yeah. I think what's like a good reference for us to kind of like how do we define it is how it embodies itself in our lives. So like I don't know about you, but like what was like your first encounter with like hate that you would kind of like recall or that you referenced to?
Me specifically?
Yeah. Want me to go first?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
It's a little, I gotta think.
For me, a little background about me. I am very small and also very brown. So when I was a kid, back in like kindergarten, like elementary, beginning, I got first exposed to kind of like bullying just because of like my like body structure and everything. So a lot of like the other kids bullied me for like my height and everything, and for like how I looked and how dark my skin was. So they like segregated me from like not like being able to like talk to other people and kind of resorted me to talk to like very little people from like those early days. So that's where like I kind of internalized that body like of hate and everything. It's kind of just like ostracizing other people just because of the way they look and everything. That's something that's out of their control too. So that's how I embody hate like now.
I didn't realize we were going back. I was like, recent moments of hate.
It is definitely internalized, but like anything,
yes.
anything like your first instance that you remember, like as a kid, too.
Elementary school.
Mm-hmm. It's always
Let's see. It's always there, right? Small child. I didn't have the best sense of fashion. Quite often I was referred to as a homeless child just because of the way I dressed. That was always fun. My front teeth were big, so I got a lot of that. What else? There was this kid who would always just come up behind me, lift up my backpack that was heavier than me, drop it, and kind of just watch me to the floor and laugh. I don't know if that's necessarily hate, but it definitely helped me internalize this idea about myself that I'm weak and I can't do shit, and I dress like a slob, I guess. I kind of still do, but I like that, so,
Right.
But I think that kind of drives a good point in how easy it is to embody and internalize this idea that you're not good enough, or that people hate you, or because people hate you, you start to hate everybody else. You know, and that's kind of what we're going to break down today. How people eventually end up internalizing this idea that they're not good enough or that they're better than somebody else, and how that drives this environment of hatefulness towards one another. I think we wanted to dedicate this episode to all the victims of hate crimes in recent times, in past times, and what undoubtedly will happen in the future. Like I said, there's just a lot going on.
Yeah.
So
it does take a toll on like everybody, even for people who aren't directly involved, because we empathize with those victims and everything, and we see ourselves in those victims.
Right. So, to anybody that's listening, or if you're watching a recording on YouTube instead of podcast services like normal people, hopefully we'll have links in our descriptions or the link tree in our Instagram for resources for campaigns and GoFundMe's that are trying to help victims of hate crimes, or if you're looking for resources yourself, I advise you to call police if you trust them. Like I said, it depends. A lot of things are gonna.
Sorry.
A lot of things are kind of funky right now, so.
Yeah, we'll definitely put that links in the description. That's definitely something I have to do. But yeah,
we will. I swear.
Yeah, moving forward to how we kind of analyze hate and everything. Datu and I kind of wanted to bring up kind of what we call like the four eyes of oppression. Not what we call, what is called the four eyes of oppression, and it kind of breaks down like how like systems of oppression are like visible today, and how it kind of like creates and like instills a cycle of hate.
Let's define hate for a second. We're just throwing that a word around. There's a lot of connotative meanings behind hate. Like hate can be, I hate cheese because it makes me gassy. I hate that anime because they killed off my favorite character. That's one way of thinking it. If you look at like the definition of the literal like Merriam-Webster definition of hate. 1. Intense hostility and aversion, usually deriving from fear, anger, or sense of injury. Extreme dislike or disgust. A systematic and especially politically exploited expression of hatred. Often used before another noun, like hate mail, hate groups, stuff like that. That's hate as a noun, and as a verb, like feeling that kind of just extreme disdain for something. That's hate. Now keep that in mind as we go over breaking down these four eyes of oppression. So getting into it. As far as the four eyes of oppression goes, I don't remember the base history of where this like kind of came up from.
Well, we both learned it from our collegiate org. Shout out to Pace.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been able to kind of like notice like systems of oppression, how they work together, and how they kind of like affect each other and affect myself or affect you. Speaking like in the second person. So, yeah, to break this down, there's like four of them. We'll go over throughout the whole episode. But first, it's going to be ideological, institutional oppression, interpersonal oppression, and internalized oppression. And those are very big words.
Yes.
Please stay with us. This is very educational.
Don't worry, we're breaking everything down.
But yeah, going off of kind of like stemming from hate, one of the first eyes of oppression, ideological, it's defined with like being like the inherent idea that one group is somehow better than the other, therefore implying like the perceived right to control like the less dominant group over like anything else.
Yeah,
giving power to the dominant group that is somehow perceived as better.
Right, and the idea of like dominance can come about in any way. It's either you have more money, you're smarter, you have more resources, you're more capable. But it's generally just this idea of thinking that you are more than something else or someone else, therefore putting you in a power dynamic.
Right. And referencing our last episode, Clark, you had how like the definition of like, or at least like the essence of white supremacy would like it stems from like this definition of ideological oppression, which is kind of like the mindset behind like anything that is like white passing and everything is more dominant, more like better than like anything that isn't white passing.
It's our culture or no culture. It's not ever this idea or conversation about inclusivity, something like that. It's almost entirely about exclusivity. How our culture is clearly the more advanced, so we're going to wipe out your culture and replace it with our own. Same idea with the spreading of like religious practices. We don't agree with the way you see the world, so we're going to teach you our faith instead, so that you see the world our way. And we'll get into that. That's kind of the that kind of goes into the next one, which is institutional oppression, and that's basically the embedding of ideological oppression into institutions of society. So your government, your education, your policing systems, the way you give people homes, the kind of jobs that are available and who works them usually. Mm-hmm. These, the cornerstones of what you consider to make society, more often than not, especially here in America. Remember that this country was created off of stolen land, out of slave labor. It's from the very get-go institutionally oppressive. And that's what that kind of means when people talk about institutional racism and you hear that shit on the news. It's like, our government's not racist, we had a black president, blah, 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 this and that. No, the system itself was built to be oppressive. That was the thing. It was in our Constitution that people of African descent were 3/5 of a person. And there's no denying that. There's no scrubbing that from history. That's where this country started.
Yeah, there's many laws, instances in history that like literally embed this ideological oppression that like of white supremacy. Literally, the 3/5 compromise, manifest destiny, like literally the Trail of Tears and everything, the pushing back of like indigenous communities in like to kind of like manifest white America. Mm-hmm. And so it's just kind of like when you notice like when you understand what these institutions are, you notice how they can kind of like oppress like different groups and everything in certain ways. How it's formed in a way where for people like Clark and I, for anybody that's watching this podcast and everything, is at disadvantage to kind of like not serve you whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Any path that you take, like literally, like everything is so political to the point where it's just like black and brown lives are not like prioritized. There's no legitimate pathway that we can do for success and everything.
Yeah, and this episode is about hate. Keep in mind, I know we're talking about oppression and this idea of dominance over one another, but how that creates an environment of hatred, this extreme disdain for one another, for people in power. And you'll see this in politics all the time. You see it right now. You saw it for the last 4 years. When somebody's in power, all they're going to do is try to stay in power. And any threat to that power, or any criticism to that power, Democrat, Republic, centrist, whatever you are, communist, whatever, the second somebody starts challenging the mainstream ideal, whoever is in charge of that is immediately going to go, that's a threat. You know? This idea that like, oh, we have the ultimate government. Democracy is the only way. Therefore, anything that's not democracy is a threat to our democracy.
Right. There was like so many civil rights activists back in the 60s who were killed. MLK, Malcolm X, JFK got killed and everything because he spoke out on like certain issues. Mm-hmm. Literally, college students who were our age, like at the time, who were protesting about the Vietnam War were shot and everything, and that still happens like all over the world. It's just kind of like examples in U.S. history that is kind of what echoes what Clark kind of said.
So, remember, like I said before, hate is this idea, or this definition of this extreme disdain, often out of fear, and that's generally what it is. When the dominant group sees that the group that they perceive to be less dominant, their target group, the people they're trying to oppress, start to come to power, start to speak up, instead of seeing that as growth in a society, something to compromise on, that's a threat. That's something they fear, because the second they see somebody challenging the institutions because their ideology is so embedded in their institutions, the second they see somebody challenging their ideology, it feels like somebody's challenging their institutions as well. So out of fear of these institutions crumbling, because suddenly people aren't happy with them anymore, they start to act out. Police is more violent against a certain group of people.
People.
Oh no, I'm that group of people, man. Shit.
Police is more violent and everything. Laws are like put in place to where disenfranchise a lot of like vulnerable groups.
And it's not even like, and this isn't even just about like race. Okay, this is like we see it today. The pay gap. This giant gap in wages for impoverished families, and those are the rich. Women and men aren't even seen as the same thing, like the same asset in a company for whatever reason.
ICE raids vulnerable communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's like anything that was like kind of passed, especially in government and everything, it's indirectly inspired by this hateful like ideology. This is like, okay, it's a way for you to control and everything, and to keep that control. Right.
So how do these institutions allow for these things to keep going? That's the biggest question, right? And that's how we kind of get into interpersonal oppression. And it's because that these like institutions are so embedded with the idea that there's one group in control and another group that needs to be controlled. Like, we need to put criminals away, not reform criminals. We need to put them away. They're a separate group of people. They don't get their rights. That's just an example of like an institution. Same with schools. We have to put our kids through a system of education in order for them to be useful to our society to a certain degree. Your bachelor will keep you from certain jobs. That's institutional oppression. Same deal. But why is that allowed to exist? Because the people that run these, the people that benefit from these systems, don't realize that they're oppressive for the most part. It's become so ingrained in society that they're just like, oh, so my belief that I, an educated Caucasian male, I'm totally fine and not in the wrong for living my life the way I am, I can just keep going about it. And for the most part, yeah, sure, that's fine. You can go about living your life. You have the privilege to do so, but you need to recognize where these systems start to put people down. It may work for you, but the problem is it doesn't work for everybody. Interpersonal oppression kind of comes from this normalization and this acceptance by the dominant group and the people within it that their beliefs are valid, that they're ratified and everything they feel is okay. But that's not just the regular individuals, that's generally all individuals in a group.
Yeah. I think what's really important is because just like what's important about interpersonal oppression is because it's the harmful like views and everything that's like stems from like some like ideological oppression is because it's backed up by these institutions, it's backed up by these like governments, it's backed up by these officials, and it's normalized within that. So people, let's say just your everyday show is very, they validate their harmful like violent like tendencies or harmful views and everything because it's backed up by the institution, it's backed up by a government, it's backed up by some form of like institution that has power to reinstate that. And that therefore that kind of like those people back up this institution, back up like why this institution is built and everything. And this whole, I fucking hate America, but like this like institutions or like the whole government is always just like oh, it's a democratic process and everything. But when the constituents are violent, when the constituents are not victims but embody interpersonal oppression, that means it also gives more power to institutional oppression as well.
Right. So keep this in mind. Look at our government today. People argue left and right that it's not a representative government. And I'm totally on that. Like it's just not, because the people that are in power are the people that get to be in power. You know, they and everyone's gonna say it's like, oh, well, other people just aren't trying hard enough, blah blah blah, this and that. Keep in mind, gerrymandering is still a thing. Filibusters are still a thing. Fucking what's the there's so many political tools in place to give whoever's in power the ability to stay in power. And getting back into interpersonal oppression. That's people to people, okay? From one person to another, from the less dominant group to the dominant group and vice versa, right? So that's why we're seeing all of this like racism and hate speech and things like that being thrown around, and nothing's being done about it for the most part, right? Members of Congress can rail on other members of Congress without any repercussions whatsoever. People can start yelling racial slurs on the street without any repercussions whatsoever. I mean, there might be repercussions. You say it to somebody's face hard enough, they might punch you, you know? But that's where the next problem comes in. Interpersonal oppression goes both ways. Okay? This, again, that's the same idea of like reverse racism, or like there is no reverse racism. It's like you can't be racist because I'm suffering more. No, it still works that way. Being racist is being racist no matter what color you are. But the problem is, if you're the person in power and you say something salacious to somebody who's not, you're more likely going to get away with it. You know? If you're a police officer and you want to racially profile somebody, you can. It's within the allowance of your job to do so. But if you're just a regular minority on the street and you want to do that to a white guy or somebody that you dislike, you're screwed. Because the eyes of the law say you can't do that, but the people in power can.
Yeah, and like how we talked about, how like whatever is perceived as a threat to any power is just like
it's danger.
It's dangerous.
It's got to be destroyed. It's got to be put away. It's got to be dealt with. Not, oh, where is this coming from? How do we address it? How do we come together and make sure that this doesn't happen again? No, the idea seems to be, this is clearly a threat. It's gonna destroy our institutions. Like that whole abolish the police kind of thing, right? That was immediately taken as a threat to the institution of the police system. And if you want to look at it that way, sure, that might be a threat to what you perceive to be a power tool, right? To control the society at large, the criminals that exist in our society. I understand. But what makes a criminal? What makes people criminalized? What makes them so hateful to the world and to their society that they want to commit crimes? That's how we get into internalized oppression.
Mm-hmm. Six Segue.
I knew I wrote this script pretty good.
But yeah, with internalized oppression, it's mostly defined with I kind of relate it to how how people like internalize their emotions and everything, and it's mostly defined as like those who suffer from these systems of oppression, i.e. like brown people, like BIPOC communities and everything, will often internalize the ideology of like inferiority and like kind of like reflect what is like socially like, what was it? Words are hard, but when you internalize this ideology, you kind of like reflect different like social like institutions and all like different like interpersonal like experiences with other people as well. How you talk to other people might be like a product of internalized oppression as well, which coincides with interpersonal oppression. So like, oh, how we talked about our like past experiences, just like, oh, these like violent acts that happened to us when we were kids and everything. We like me with my height, Clark, you with your like clothes and everything. We end up internalizing that same like acts of violence towards us. We start believing in that, right. And therefore we kind of like reinforce that type of like oppression into like other aspects of our lives and everything, especially interpersonal.
Right. And like, so basically, like, if you're told your whole life from the get-go that you're unworthy piece of crap, blah blah blah, this and that, you're gonna believe it, you know, especially if it's starting off as something as like when you're a child, everything's impressionable. You start to take in the world around you the way it is, the way your institutions are set up. If you feel like you're not good enough, and then you see that in all of our institutions the people in power aren't the color of your skin, that's another thing that you start to internalize. You realize, oh, I don't see somebody like me up there, that means people like me don't get to be up there. And so it's like, and it's like with the problem is when these like minority groups start to internalize this inferiority, they can't act out. And that's the problem. Like we were saying before, you can't act against the system in place that's telling you the way you think is wrong. You know, the way you see the world is wrong. So what happens? They start acting out against each other. They start raising their kids to be afraid of the system that they were born into. Why do African American families have to teach their children how to talk to police? That right there is one of the biggest indications of institutional oppression, internalized oppression, you know? This idea, they've already decided they need to raise their children to be afraid. When in reality, they're supposed to be in the same country as the same citizen, but they're not. And they already understand that they're not, because from the get-go, this is how it's been.
Yeah, this also goes into just like different like types of institutions as well, not just kind of like government as well, but also in schools and churches especially. Like in school, if you're not kind of like getting the grades that like your teacher wants you to have, you're automatically, for some teachers, automatically treat you differently, automatically give you like exceptions of this, expect failure from you. And it's kind of, this happens a lot in my high school and everything, but like anything that wasn't a passing grade, you're automatically kind of like put on like a certain list and everything, a certain watch list, have more like counselors like review your like transcripts and everything, or have like teachers kind of like talk to you in a certain way just because you're not passing class. It's in a way, it's a way where like institutions kind of instill their ideologies so that you can internalize it better. And if you're not falling in line, then you're a failure as well. It goes a lot with school. That's why I fucking hate school sometimes, because if I'm not passing and everything, that feels like I'm not learning, but in reality it's just like set up in a way for like my like thought process and my mindset of learning isn't really supported in that system. And
wait for our episode on education.
Oh, fucking damn it. I fucking hate academia so fucking much. Academia can kiss the brownest parts of my ass. But going off of like internalized oppression and everything, it really affects like your soul. When so many like different aspects of society is implicitly telling you that you don't belong, or you don't have power, you are a failure, or you're like perceived in a fearful way, then you start to kind of like beat yourself up a lot. It's so easy to give up as a brown person, honestly, and it's really fucking hard to just like keep going.
That being said, like I was saying before, where do you think criminals, quote unquote, in our society come from? People become criminals because we call them criminals, you know? Especially when you develop this idea that you're not good enough, that you can't make it in society the way that it was designed. Instead of looking to create a life for yourself, do something like this, you're looking to survive. And then you start resorting to things where you think that the only way you can get about living a life now is to turning to things to simply help you survive. And that's kind of just at the core of people in general. That's part of your response to threats to your livelihood, to your life, stuff like that. You do things you need to do to survive. And you ask most people in minority communities, they're going to tell you the same thing. Whatever they're doing, they're doing to survive. So when people start organizing themselves into gangs to sell drugs to make money, that's because they'd already gave up on themselves and the idea that they were going to be part of the society that exists right now.
The institution already put like a profile on them to where like they can't get a fucking job at Walmart because they have a criminal record. They can't sign up for like benefits and everything because of like how like they're perceived and everything. Literally, there's no other option but to like do what you gotta do to like protect yourself and protect your family and just make it another day and everything.
Right. If our police system was really designed for rehabilitation, like the way they say it's supposed to be, then we would reinstate rights to people who do their time. We would make sure that they can re-ingrain themselves in society as productive people. No, the second they're out of jail, they still don't have most of their rights. So what are they going to do? They're just going to go back to what they were doing before, because that was the only thing that made them, that gave them a livelihood, right? But no, once a prisoner, always a prisoner. You come from some other country, you're destined to be a gangster, a rapist, something like this or other.
No other jobs. I don't got any other job opportunities, but there's one open. Might as well keep doing what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. And it's not even that. The same thing with just our job markets today, right? Oh, we have all this farmland and stuff. We need somebody to farm it. We don't have a lot of people out here. We got a lot of people migrating here, looking for jobs.
Let's hire them for below any livable wage.
Oh, and the second they want to unionize and be represented, we're not going to let them do that. No. Because we're in power, and we said they can't do that. They're not allowed to have a voice.
What do they do? Some of them don't even have citizenship. Let's fucking, like, take away what little rights they have anyway. Like, even that is an aspect of that. Of power, of institutional, like, oppression and everything. And when you look into all of these, like, four eyes of oppression and everything, just, like, we're speaking in a way just like, what? If you don't get it, it's just like, what? Who's being oppressed? Who? And that's the point of like where intersectionality comes in, where different aspects of people's identity, which is like from different like class structures, from race, from ethnicity, from gender, from sexuality, to religion, to citizenship status, any like location, everything. You can like any category of that identity, there's always an oppressed, less dominant group and everything. And those are the people that we're referring to that are being oppressed. And I guess to kind of make this conversation a little like more like not fluid. Keep any instance where I want to see my name. But like keep it more like easy to follow is like there's this dominant like group is a white Anglo-Saxon. Am I even saying that right? I feel like I'm like saying an instrument. White Anglo-Saxon heterosexual male who kind of it's that group that kind of still like continues and like builds up these like institutions of oppression and everything and still pushes for that and everything. So that's kind of what we're referring to, and kind of like to help you kind of not eliminate these oppressions, but kind of like get out of a state of just like internalizing hate and everything within yourself. You kind of like kind of know what your intersectional identities do and kind of like get power from that.
Yeah. I kind of want to tie these two topics together. If you haven't noticed, we kind of use all of these four eyes very interchangeably depending on the situation we're talking about. And like Chris said, no matter where you look in your intersectionalities, somebody's being oppressed in one way or another. And the same way you look at internalized, institutional, ideological, interpersonal oppression, none of them can exist without the other. The ideological oppression, that's at the base of it. It's just the idea itself. The idea that you are more than somebody else. The second you have that, everything else kind of falls into place. And nothing really exists without the other. If you look at it like a Venn diagram, like the two circles where they intersect, and think of it as four circles. And now put all those 4 circles together so that they're all crossing into one another. That's basically the 4 eyes of oppression. You can't just start taking one out. You can't just start not being racist, you know? You have to start looking at, oh, okay, so my language in my interpersonal relationships, that's one way to address it, right? If you're in the less dominant group, it's starting to address your own internalized oppression, you know? And the other side of that is internalized privilege as well. If you're in the dominant group and you realize your whole life, everything you've been doing has been backed up by society and everything's okay, you're not going to realize at all that you're privileged. It's the same deal where people complain that, like, oh, white privilege isn't a thing. It is. I'm sorry to tell you, kind of is. And the fact that you don't realize it is proof that it is. That's the whole spiel right there. Addressing these one by one really isn't the right way to go about it. It's kind of just addressing it as a whole, understanding who you are first at the root of everything, understanding your own intersections, which we'll probably do another episode about, because it's kind of its own literal web of things.
And I think once you understand how these different like systems of oppression are connected and everything, it's very it's very pressure. There's a lot of like grief towards that and everything, which we talked about in the last last episode. But once you kind of like get to point out like how these systems of oppressions are connected, you can find ways to where you can kind of dismantle those systems and everything. Because once you dismantle one of them, you dismantle them all. So, it's mostly kind of like on like us speaking as a collective to kind of find a way we can like kind of like dismantle that together.
Yeah, and that's where we're gonna get to on the next episode following this one, and is how to address hate and these systems of oppression. But like Chris was saying, the second you take down one, you take down all of them. Since ideological basically is the root of it all, and the end basically of that is your internalized oppression, where these systems don't need to be so blatantly hateful and oppressive. Once you've internalized it, it's game over. You're in that loop now. You start to feed back into the system of inferiority. Because you feel inferior, somebody else will feel superior. And then the cycle continues, and then we start putting people in power that, again, start to mirror those ideals and stuff like that, you know? So what we're getting at, and what you'll probably find in the next episode, is that when you want to address hate and you want to start dismantling these systems, it's not the same as dismantling the institutions. We can change those systems. That's hopefully what our government was designed to do, was to be changed, which I think people forget. You start with yourself. Start by understanding yourself. Start by understanding that you're not inferior. You're not inferior to anybody. You are a living human being, just like any other person on this planet. Okay? And further, just anything that's alive on this planet. And that's where you start to understand this idea of thinking suddenly, oh, I am equal to other people. Mm-hmm. Other people do deserve the same rights as me.
Right.
You know?
It's that kind of revelation and epiphany that you can have within yourself that you start to spiral in a way of just kind of like decolonizing, kind of like liberating yourself from these like systems of oppression and everything. It's not going to happen right away. We're still like, you can't, just because you feel better about yourself and everything does not mean the institutions are going to stop doing that. But it's a way that you can kind of start to learn and everything, and start to kind of like feed into dismantling like these oppressions and everything. And that's why this podcast exists, is because like our society as a whole is generally just like treating Black and Indigenous people of color just like worthless, less than human in a way. And our society's culture is kind of like implicitly telling us that just like we're not worth it. Like,
it's not even implicitly. For the last 4 years, it's been...
Not even the last 4 years. Just from the inception of this... Ever.
Yeah, it's always been this idea like that, this. Like, the BIPOC community literally has to fight for their right. From emancipation to the civil rights to the Black Lives Matter movement right now. Why does that have to be a fight? You know, from the very get-go, it's been this idea, you don't have the rights, but you have to fight for it. You have to rail against the system in order to get what you want. When in reality, the system was designed for them not to have what they want at all. And they recognize that. And the second that they start speaking up, the people in power are like, oh God, we got to put that down.
Even if you're marching peaceful, you're still going to get like assassinated as well. So if you're gonna like speak out on something, you might as well fight. You might as well fucking do that. So, and you can't continue to stand up for yourself if you don't believe in yourself first. And that's why it's so important to dismantle that internalized messaging within yourself. That's why this podcast exists, because it's to create narratives for people like us so that we can believe in ourselves. We can see ourselves in these conversations, and we can kind of like speak it to ourselves more. And like Clark said, you can't really like break these down until like you have that conversation with yourself.
Mm-hmm. You can't talk to the person that hates you if you hate yourself. You know, you can't have that conversation with the systems of power that are, you know, very overtly like oppressive and hateful towards other
not even like
groups.
Bothering to listen or hear you out and everything.
Yeah.
Or like waiting their turn to speak on that. You can't argue for semantics forever and everything. You gotta just find a way to work.
And the thing is, you can't reciprocate that hate, because that's where the cycle continues.
It is super easy to.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get us wrong.
It's really easy to just start hating on the people that are putting you down, and vice versa. The people you put down, it's super easy to hate. You know, if you're in power and you see that people are, it seems like they're gonna mess with your way of life, the first thing you're gonna do is go fuck those people. You know, it's like, oh, well, it was the whole idea of the Cold War to begin with. You know, it's just like, oh, we're a democracy. Fuck Russia.
Fuck that communist way of life.
Yeah, and I don't agree with the government of Russia either. That's all I'm saying. But that's not communism either. That's authoritarianism. Same with any of these countries that claim to be like the People's Party, communism, blah, 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 this and that. It's just, it's really not what you think it is.
Right. So, the first way for you to reciprocate hate is to yourself. Definitely. And then, like, referencing our first episode, what Clark said, just like, the more you want to beat yourself up, the more you want to beat up other people.
Right.
And, sorry, I use that quote all the time because it's really helping me with my own fucking, like, self-discovery journey. But
it's working.
Wow, I listen to my own podcast and everything. Wow. Anyways. I think for the easiest way to navigate through these 4 I's of suppression is to kind of like tackle your own internalized suppression first and foremost.
Start realizing where you hate yourself and whether or not you think it's valid. It most likely isn't. You're trying your best. You know, you're doing your best with the hand you've been dealt in a system that wasn't designed for you in the first place. And that's where that train of thinking should go, where you realize it's not your fault.
Right. And once you realize that there's so many barriers in life to like stop you from like succeeding, you end up empowering yourself to find that way for yourself.
Yeah, to break down those barriers.
Yeah.
If you feel like, oh, the education system doesn't work for me, suddenly you want to do better than the education system that exists, right? I mean, these are just examples and kind of get into it.
I guess we'll go into it in like another, like in the next episode, but like, to kind of like give like a TLDR, the best way to like fight back from the oppression is kind of like, you know, start somewhere. Start with yourself.
Roll credits.
Yeah, that was very educational, yada yada yada, and everything. It was very. My brain is just fried from everything. But I guess before we like check out and everything, like check in with like each other, you, me, Clark, and everything. That's just like, what is one thing you want to tell everybody ending off and everything.
You first.
Why me first?
I have too many inspirational quotes I need to think of.
Let me just pull up from my fucking notes app titled Therapy.
Oh.
Hold up. Let me do this real quick. Wait, I already... Oh, God. I can't. I asked this question and I can't even answer it. But just like... I just know on TikTok there's all these memes about people in the future who study 2020 are just gonna freak out about all this shit that just happened. But the fact of the matter is that historians are the ones who interpret and document history, and it's up to the people in charge of academia that will decide what kind of topics and perspectives get to be taught in schools. And then it goes to the kind of teachers and how they teach these topics. And I said this earlier, but there are so many barriers put in place in front of you to stop you from succeeding. Find that path, make that path your own, and make sure others can follow that path too. Roll credits.
Ooh. Okay, I figured out what I wanted to say. Kind of just wherever you are, whatever you're doing, before you listen to our next episode, if you can, try to track down where you're from. Country, place of origin, just get an idea of your family's story, at the very least. How you got to where you are today. It'll be hopefully helpful into easing yourself into the next episode where we start to break everything down. Like we were saying before, understanding yourself is going to be one of the first steps. And for a lot of the BIPOC or AAPI community, looking at your family's immigration story is going to be a good place to start. However they tell it to you, however you find out about it, just try to get an idea of what it took for your family to get here, you know? Not saying to use that as a guilt tool or anything, just look at it. Just look at how your family got here, what they had to do to get here. If you are of European descent, you should also take a look at how your family got here. Just saying, looking back at the history of how your family gets things done and the way they get about here is a good way to give yourself the foundation for understanding yourself a little bit more. If you understand the kind of resilience that exists within your family, this is also going to help you understand the way your family treats you. Like I said, like we were saying before with internalized depression, you might have been raised to believe certain things because of the way your family came here, you know. Like I said, before we sign off, if you can, just try to take some time to look at where you came from, but don't look at it to beat yourself up. Look at it as the foundation for your growth. My favorite quote is from a tree I saw in Hawaii, and I was in a park, and there was a little sign that said, "From our roots we grow."
Oh.
And I was like,
that's so cute.
Wow, that was incredibly insightful from a tree in a park.
Not these fucking dumbass white philosophers and everything. No, I learned better shit from a tree. Fuck you, Socrates.
Well, I mean, that's how it goes, right? Where you understand where you come from, once you lay down your roots, the only way to go from here is up.
Period. And with that, thank y'all for watching. Thank y'all for listening. Whatever you're doing, whatever you're perceiving us at, thank you. We appreciate y'all. Yeah, I've been Fluid.
This is Datu.
And y'all listen to
Brown Conversation. Haha.